The cold wind howled through the trees as Emily stared out at the twisted branches overhead. The towering pines seemed to shift under the dim light of the moon, their long fingers scratching at the sky. She and her group of friends had ventured deep into Blackwood Forest for what was supposed to be a thrilling Halloween camping trip. But now, as they set up their tents, an unsettling feeling crept up her spine. There was something wrong about this place. "Hey, Mark called from across the clearing, breaking her thoughts. "You gonna help with the fire or just daydream all night?" Emily forced a smile and walked over to join the group. There was Mark, the jokester of the group, with his ever-present grin, Sarah, her best friend and always the skeptic, and Jake, the quiet but strong one, who preferred actions over words. The four of them had been close since college, and they often planned these little adventures, but this Halloween felt different. The air was heavy, and the silence of the forest felt unnatural. As the fire crackled to life, they gathered around it, sipping from their mugs of warm cider. Sarah started telling ghost stories, each one more ridiculous than the last. The others laughed, but Emily couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. The shadows in the forest seemed to pulse with life, almost as if the trees themselves were leaning in, listening. It was when the stories faded and the group fell into a comfortable quiet that Jake spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Have any of you heard of the Blackwood Curse?" The crackling fire was the only sound for a moment as his words lingered in the air. Sarah scoffed. "Here we go, another one of Jake's creepy stories." But Jake wasn't laughing. He stared into the flames, his face eerily illuminated. "It's not a story," he said softly. "It's an old legend. This forest was once considered sacred ground, used for rituals, offerings, things people don't like to talk about anymore. They say that on Halloween night, the spirits of the dead rise from the earth, seeking revenge on anyone who dares to tread on their land." Emily felt a chill crawl down her spine. Mark, ever the skeptic, snorted. "Oh, come on, man. It's Halloween. Every place has some creepy story to go with it." But Jake wasn't finished. "The locals believe that if you camp here on the wrong night, the dead will come for you. And they won't stop until every intruder is dealt with." "Dealt with?" Sarah repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "No one really knows. But they say people who come here on Halloween disappear, or worse." The wind seemed to pick up just then, making the trees sway violently, casting grotesque shadows across the ground. Emily shuddered, feeling the temperature drop. "Enough with the horror stories," Mark said, standing up and dusting off his jeans. "I'm going to the river to get some more water. Anyone coming?" "I'll go," Emily said quickly, eager to shake the eerie feeling the story had given her. As they walked together through the darkened woods, the sound of their footsteps crunching leaves seemed unnervingly loud. Emily kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something move between the trees. But each time, there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the forest. When they reached the river, Mark knelt to fill the water bottles, and Emily stood still, listening to the wind. The water's surface shimmered under the moonlight, reflecting the silver clouds that had begun to roll in. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the trees behind them. "Did you hear that?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Mark stood up, his brow furrowed. Probably just an animal. But Emily wasn't so sure. The sound was growing louder, closer, like footsteps in the underbrush. Her heart raced as she peered into the darkness, trying to make out any movement. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. At first, Emily thought it was Jake or Sarah playing a prank. But as the figure came closer, her breath caught in her throat. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow, but its movements were unnatural, jerky, as if it wasn't entirely in control of its own body. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice shaking slightly. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stopped a few feet away, standing deathly still. Emily could feel the blood drain from her face as she realized something was terribly wrong. The figure stepped into the faint moonlight, revealing a face that was pale, gaunt, and impossibly old, like something that had been dead for centuries but refused to decay. Its hollow eyes locked onto Emily, and for a moment, she felt as though the earth beneath her feet had vanished. Her legs trembled. "Run!" she screamed, grabbing Mark's arm. Without another word, they turned and fled back through the woods, the sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves growing louder behind them. The woods closed in on them as Emily and Mark sprinted through the underbrush, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness seemed to thicken with every step, the moonlight barely piercing the canopy of trees overhead. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with the image of that figure, its hollow, lifeless eyes burned into her memory. They reached the camp in a frenzy, stumbling into the clearing where Jake and Sarah sat by the fire, oblivious to the terror that had just unfolded. Emily could barely speak, her body trembling with fear. Something's out there," she gasped, clutching Mark's arm. "We saw it." Jake stood up, his face stern, though his eyes flickered with concern. "What do you mean? What did you see?" It wasn't human," Mark said, his voice low, shaken for the first time since they'd arrived. "Something's wrong with this place." Sarah laughed nervously, the tension palpable. "Come on, you guys, stop messing around. You're just trying to scare us." But Emily knew it wasn't a joke. Her gut told her this was something far more ancient, something terrible that should have been left undisturbed. The stories Jake had told earlier, the cursed ground, the vengeful spirits, suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. The night felt alive with a presence, an oppressive force that whispered through the wind and twisted the very air they breathed. "Listen to me!" Emily cried, her voice more desperate than she intended. "We need to leave. Now." The firelight flickered ominously as the wind picked up, the flames dancing wildly, casting grotesque shapes on the trees. Jake's expression darkened, his usually calm demeanor cracking under the weight of Emily's panic. "What exactly did you see?" Mark swallowed hard. It looked like a man, but it wasn't. Pale, lifeless, like a corpse walking. The moment the words left his mouth, the air seemed to thicken with an unnatural chill, as though the forest itself had begun to listen. From the darkness beyond the circle of firelight, Emily thought she heard something, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. A faint whisper, carried on the wind. "Leave." It wasn't a voice, not in the traditional sense, but a suggestion, an oppressive thought that pressed down on her mind like a weight. Emily's heart raced as she glanced at the others, wondering if they had heard it too. But before she could speak, the fire suddenly sputtered, the flames shrinking as if smothered by some unseen force. Sarah's eyes widened. What the hell is going on? A sense of dread fell over the group like a thick fog. The once vibrant woods now felt alien, as if the very land had become hostile, awakening to the presence of intruders. Jake's gaze darted around the clearing, his hand unconsciously reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "We need to go back to the car," he said quietly, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his voice. "Now." But as they gathered their things in a hurried panic, the sound of movement came again, this time closer, unmistakable. The soft rustling of leaves, the crunch of footsteps on brittle twigs, all coming from just beyond the tree line. "Stay together," Jake muttered, his voice barely audible as he tightened his grip on the knife. The others huddled close, fear palpable in the air as they took hesitant steps toward the path that would lead them out of the woods. But the path no longer seemed clear. The forest, once familiar and navigable, had twisted into a labyrinth of shadows and indistinct shapes, as though the land itself had shifted to prevent their escape. Then came the sound, a low, guttural growl, not like any animal they had ever heard. It vibrated through the trees, a malevolent sound that seemed to come from the very earth. Emily froze, her eyes wide with terror as she scanned the darkness. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw them, shapes moving in the shadows, figures too numerous to count, all creeping toward them. They were not alive, and yet they moved. Bodies decayed and broken, rising from the earth as if summoned by the malevolent force that controlled this cursed place. Hollow-eyed and gaunt, they lumbered forward, their movements jerky, as though driven by some dark instinct. "Run!" Jake shouted, shoving Sarah ahead of him as he brandished the knife. The group broke into a sprint, but the forest itself seemed to close in on them, the trees shifting, branches clawing at their skin, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath their feet. As they fled deeper into the forest, Emily's mind raced, piecing together fragments of the story Jake had told. The sacred ground, the ancient rituals performed here, hadn't just been forgotten. They had been sealed away, left undisturbed for centuries. And now, their mere presence had awakened something that should have remained buried in the earth. The dead were no longer content to rest. Panic surged through her as the whispers grew louder, no longer just in the air but in her mind, clawing at her sanity. Words she didn't understand, languages long dead, seemed to swirl around her, threatening to pull her under. It was as if the forest itself was alive, breathing, watching, waiting. Ahead of her, Mark stumbled, crashing into the undergrowth. I can't run anymore," he gasped, his face pale as he clutched his side. But there was no time to stop. The figures were closing in, their cold, dead hands reaching out from the shadows. Emily's heart pounded as she pulled Mark to his feet, forcing him forward, her own legs burning with exhaustion. But no matter how fast they ran, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. And deep down, Emily knew the truth. They were no longer the hunters in these woods. They were the hunted. The forest seemed to warp around them, bending to an ancient will that none of them could fully comprehend. Emily's feet pounded the earth as she ran, the oppressive darkness swallowing every sound except the frantic beating of her heart. The cold, decayed hands of the dead were always just behind her, brushing against her skin, pulling at her mind. She could feel their presence, silent, unrelenting, as if the earth itself had birthed them to reclaim what was once sacred. The group was scattered now, each person running blindly into the forest's maw, their desperate breaths mingling with the whispers of the ancient woods. Mark had fallen behind, his wheezing coughs barely audible against the rush of wind through the twisted trees. Emily's legs burned, but the terror inside her fueled her forward, fueled all of them forward, until survival was the only thing that mattered. But no matter how fast they ran, the woods seemed to bend and stretch before them, its shape shifting in ways that defied logic. Paths that had been clear moments before dissolved into a maze of gnarled roots and dense thickets. And through it all, the dead followed, tireless, unyielding. Mark stumbled again, collapsing to the ground with a groan of pain. Emily skidded to a stop, torn between the instinct to flee and the impossible thought of leaving him behind. The forest was alive with the sound of movement, rustling leaves, the snapping of twigs, and the distant, guttural moan of something unnatural. Mark, get up," she pleaded, her voice trembling with urgency as she knelt beside him, her hands shaking. But as her fingers touched his shoulder, she felt the icy chill that had seeped into his skin. He was drenched in sweat, his face ghostly pale under the moonlight. I can't." His voice was hoarse, broken, his body weakened by a fear that had taken root deep within. Emily looked into his eyes and saw it there, the same terror that gnawed at her own soul, but there was something more, something she couldn't quite place. His gaze was distant, unfocused, as if the forest itself had already claimed him. Then came the sound again, the low, guttural growl. "Closer now. Too close." "Emily, you have to leave me," Mark gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're here." Tears stung Emily's eyes, but there was no time to cry, no time for grief. The darkness pressed in, thick with the stench of decay and death, and the shadows moved with purpose, forming indistinct figures that lurched closer with every passing second. They were surrounded. In a panic, Emily pulled Mark to his feet, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. Together, they stumbled forward, deeper into the forest, away from the encroaching shapes. But every step felt futile. The earth beneath them seemed to shift, as though the forest itself were alive, its roots and branches conspiring to lead them into the very heart of the nightmare. Ahead, through the trees, Emily saw the faintest glimmer of light, a small clearing, illuminated by a soft, eerie glow that flickered like a dying flame. Desperation surged within her as she dragged Mark toward it, hoping, praying, that it might offer some refuge from the horrors that pursued them. But as they reached the clearing, Emily's heart sank. There, in the center of the open space, stood an ancient stone altar, its surface etched with strange, cryptic symbols that pulsed faintly in the moonlight. Surrounding the altar were figures, statues, or what she thought were statues at first, each one twisted and deformed, their stone faces frozen in expressions of agony and fear. Some had the unmistakable look of once being human, but others were grotesque, alien, their forms not of this world. Mark collapsed beside her, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. What is this place?" he whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. Emily didn't answer. She didn't know. All she could feel was the overwhelming dread that radiated from the altar, as though the very ground around it was cursed, poisoned by some ancient, unspeakable force. This was the heart of the forest, the source of the evil that had awoken tonight. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air with a cacophony of voices speaking in languages long forgotten. The dead had followed them here, drawn to this place as if by instinct, and Emily could feel their cold presence gathering around the clearing, their hollow eyes fixed on the altar. Mark struggled to his feet, swaying as if under some unseen force. "It's calling them," he muttered, his voice distant, his eyes fixed on the altar. "This place, it's where they came from." Emily's blood ran cold as she looked at him, fear gnawing at the edges of her sanity. Mark's expression was vacant, almost trance-like, as though the forest, this cursed ground, had already claimed him. And then, from the shadows, they emerged. The dead, pale and rotting, their bodies broken and twisted, shuffled into the clearing. But now, in the dim moonlight, Emily could see them more clearly. Their faces, some recognizable, others distorted beyond human semblance, bore expressions of rage and torment. They were the restless spirits of those who had once lived here, long ago, and they had been awakened from their eternal slumber. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling Emily's mind with a chorus of voices, each one demanding vengeance, retribution for the desecration of their sacred ground. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as the dead closed in around them. "Emily." "I hear them," Mark said, his voice distant, as though he were no longer entirely himself. "They want us to join them." Emily's heart hammered in her chest as the figures crept closer, their hollow eyes staring, unblinking, at her. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the crushing fear of knowing that there was no escape from this place. The dead were here, and they would not leave without claiming what was theirs. But as Emily's mind teetered on the edge of madness, a new sound pierced the night, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the altar itself. The symbols carved into the stone began to glow brighter, pulsing with a dark energy that filled the clearing with an unnatural light. And then, from the earth itself, something began to rise. As the ground trembled beneath Emily's feet, her breath froze in her throat. She watched in mute horror as the ancient altar seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, casting an eerie glow over the faces of the dead that surrounded them. Mark, still in a daze, swayed beside her, his eyes locked onto the growing rift in the earth. His skin was ashen, his pupils dilated, as if something had already taken hold of his mind. From the ground, a low rumble reverberated, a sound that felt far too deep to belong to anything of this world. It was as if the very bones of the earth had been awakened, groaning in protest against the disturbance of the ancient resting place. The symbols etched into the stone flared with a blinding light, illuminating the twisted trees and the horrified faces of the dead, who had halted in their tracks as if waiting for some dark judgment. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs felt leaden, as if the forest itself were holding her captive. She could only stare as the earth beneath the altar split open, revealing a deep, yawning void, a cavernous abyss that defied all reason. From its depths, a rancid wind gusted forth, carrying with it the stench of decay, rot, and something far older than death itself. Suddenly, a figure began to rise from the chasm, a grotesque shape that should not exist. Its form was massive, yet it seemed to shift and writhe, as if composed of shadow and nightmare. At first, it appeared as an amorphous mass of tendrils and limbs, but as it ascended, it began to take shape, an abominable caricature of something that might have once resembled life. Its limbs were elongated, twisted at impossible angles, and its skin was mottled with patches of decay and unnatural growth. Eyes, too many eyes, glistened in the moonlight, each one filled with an unspeakable malevolence, each one focused intently on Emily and Mark. Emily gasped, choking on the acrid air that filled her lungs, as the entity rose to its full height, towering over the altar. Its very presence was an affront to reality, an insult to the natural order. This thing, this abomination, had been buried deep beneath the forest for centuries, bound by forces long forgotten, but now it had been freed. Mark, still under the thrall of the altar's power, took a stumbling step forward, his hand outstretched toward the creature. His voice was faint, barely a whisper, as he muttered, They called it forth. They want us to join them." Emily grabbed his arm, pulling him back with all the strength she could muster. "Mark, no," she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation. "We have to get out of here." But it was too late. The thing from the abyss moved, its grotesque form shifting in ways that defied logic. Its tendrils reached out, curling around the altar with a sickening slither. The dead, those restless spirits that had risen from their graves, bowed their heads in reverence to the creature, as if they recognized it, as if they worshipped it. The whispers in Emily's mind intensified, growing louder and more insistent, threatening to drive her mad. She could feel them now, the voices of the dead, the ancient souls that had been bound to this cursed forest for centuries. They had been awakened by the presence of this abomination, and now they sought to claim the living as their own. Mark fell to his knees, his body trembling as he stared up at the creature with wide, unblinking eyes. It's beautiful," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. Emily shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. This thing was not beautiful, it was a horror beyond comprehension, a manifestation of something far darker and older than the human mind could ever hope to grasp. The longer she looked at it, the more her sanity seemed to fray at the edges, unraveling under the weight of the incomprehensible. She had to escape. Without another word, Emily turned and fled, her feet pounding the earth as she raced through the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, but she didn't stop. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the dead shuffling through the undergrowth, their hollow voices calling out to her, begging her to return to the altar, to join them in their eternal torment. But she would not. She could not. As Emily ran, the whispers in her mind grew fainter, but they never fully disappeared. The presence of the ancient thing still lingered, a dark stain on her soul that she could never shake. She didn't know how far she had run, or how much time had passed, but eventually, the forest began to thin, and the pale glow of the moon shone through the canopy once more. She stumbled into a small clearing, her chest heaving with exhaustion. For a moment, she thought she might be safe, free from the horrors that had pursued her. But as she collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion, she heard it again, the low, resonant hum that had emanated from the altar. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, and it filled her with a deep, primal dread. Emily looked up, her eyes wide with terror. The forest had not released her. The ancient evil that had been awakened still lingered, its influence reaching far beyond the clearing, far beyond the altar. And as the shadows around her seemed to shift and writhe, she realized the terrible truth. She had not escaped. The forest had become a labyrinth, its shadows twisting into grotesque forms, towering above Emily like watchful sentinels. Each breath she took seemed to echo back at her, distorted by the trees as though the very air were mocking her. She had long since lost any sense of direction. North, south, east, west, all collapsed into a meaningless void of tangled roots and ancient branches. The earth beneath her feet had grown soft, almost sticky, as though the soil itself sought to claim her. Emily's mind was unraveling. The once clear boundary between reality and nightmare had dissolved, leaving her adrift in a world where nothing could be trusted. She swore she heard voices. No, not voices, whispers, hissing through the leaves, carried on the unnatural wind that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. They were too faint to decipher, but their intent was clear. They were not the comforting murmurs of the living. These were the susurrations of the dead, mocking her futile struggle to escape. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she forced herself to continue, stumbling forward blindly. Every now and then, her gaze would catch on something, a flicker in the corner of her eye, a shadow darting between the trees. She would whirl around, certain that something was following her, only to be met with the oppressive silence of the forest. But she knew it was there, watching, waiting. The whispers grew louder. Ahead, the trees parted slightly, revealing a clearing bathed in a sickly green glow. At its center stood a weathered stone, ancient and worn, with grotesque symbols carved deep into its surface. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, dread gnawing at her insides. She approached the stone, drawn by a force she couldn't comprehend, her mind screaming at her to turn back, but her body moving of its own accord. The symbols seemed to pulse with life, writhing before her eyes as if they were not simply carved, but alive, crawling across the stone's surface. She reached out, compelled by a force beyond her will, her fingertips brushing the cold, rough surface. At the moment of contact, a wave of nausea surged through her, and a violent vision struck her mind with such intensity that she staggered backward, her scream swallowed by the ever-present silence of the forest. She saw them, the dead. Not as they had been in life, but as they had become. Twisted, decayed remnants of what once were human forms, their hollow eyes gleaming with unnatural light. They clawed their way from the earth, their flesh hanging in ragged tatters, their mouths wide in silent wails of torment. And yet, even more horrifying than their physical decay was the sense of purpose in their movements. They were not mindless beings driven by hunger. They were soldiers of a forgotten war, rising once more to protect their cursed land. Emily collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The vision faded, but its weight remained, pressing down on her chest like a cold, suffocating hand. The whispers in the wind became clearer, more insistent. They were calling her. Not to join them in death, but to take her place in a ritual older than memory itself. The earth beneath her pulsed, alive with the dark energy of the thing that slumbered deep below the roots of the forest, awakened now by their presence. She tried to scream again, but her voice betrayed her, strangled by the weight of the truth. There was no escape from this place. The forest had claimed them all the moment they had set foot on its sacred soil. In that moment, she understood. The legends had not been mere superstitions whispered to scare children away from the woods. They were warnings. Warnings that had gone unheeded for centuries, for there was no salvation from what lay in wait within this cursed forest. The dead did not rise out of vengeance or anger. They rose because it was their duty, bound to the earth by a force far more ancient and terrifying than death itself. Her mind fractured further, the reality of her situation settling in with chilling clarity. She was not lost. She had been claimed. The whispers confirmed it. "Join us," they hissed, closer now, more demanding. "You belong here." Emily's vision blurred, her limbs heavy and uncooperative. Her body felt as if it were sinking, the ground pulling her in, as if the soil itself wanted to reclaim her. She clawed at the earth, desperate to break free, but it was futile. Each movement only brought her deeper into the cold embrace of the forest floor. And still, the whispers grew louder. As the night deepened, an eerie stillness enveloped the forest, pressing in around Emily like a suffocating shroud. The whispers had faded, leaving only the unsettling rustle of leaves, yet she felt the weight of countless eyes watching her from the shadows, their intent hidden beneath the surface of the night. Desperation clawed at her mind, an insistent voice urging her to flee, to escape the horrific fate that loomed over her like a dark cloud. But as she fought against the primal pull of the earth, she could feel something awakening within the forest, something vast and terrible, stirring beneath the roots of ancient trees. The ground trembled beneath her, a deep rumble that resonated through her very bones, as if the forest itself were alive and stirring from a long slumber. She looked toward the clearing, where the stone stood, its sinister symbols glowing with an otherworldly light. They seemed to pulsate with a heartbeat, a rhythm that echoed the slow awakening of the ancient force hidden within the soil. "Join us," the whispers returned, a low, sonorous chant that rolled over her like the tide. She realized, with mounting horror, that the words were not merely a plea. They were an invitation to something far more sinister, a call to the dark deity that lay dormant beneath their feet, eager for the offering of souls. Suddenly, the earth erupted in a violent upheaval. The stone trembled, and with it came a cacophony of anguished cries, the sounds of the restless dead rising to answer the call. Figures began to emerge from the ground, those who had once been lost to the forest, their hollow eyes filled with an insatiable hunger. The vision she had experienced earlier flooded back, vivid and terrible, as she witnessed them pull themselves from the soil, one by one, their bodies distorted by decay, yet driven by an unholy purpose. "Feed the devourer," they cried in unison, their voices a chilling harmony that resonated through the trees. "Feed it with your essence." Emily stumbled backward, her heart racing as she realized the grim truth. This was no mere gathering of the dead. This was a ritual, a dark summoning meant to awaken an entity that had slumbered for eons. The forest, this cursed expanse of land, was a gateway, a threshold through which the devourer could rise and consume the living. With newfound determination, she turned to flee. She could not allow this to happen. The memories of her friends flashed through her mind, Jason, Maria, and the others, lost in the horrors of the night. They had come to this place seeking adventure, and now they were bound to this hellish fate. But the forest had other plans. Branches reached out like skeletal hands, tangling in her hair and clothing, pulling her back toward the gathering of the dead. Shadows danced around her, closing in as the whispers grew into a frenzied chorus. "Join us," they called, and the words twisted into a promise, a lure of dark power and eternal life. "You will never be alone." As she fought against the encroaching darkness, Emily glimpsed a flicker of movement, a figure struggling against the throng of undead. It was Jason, his face pale and drawn, terror etched into his features as he clawed his way toward her, his eyes wide with desperation. "Emily," he shouted, his voice barely rising above the din. "We have to get out of here. They're trying to take us." With a surge of adrenaline, she dashed toward him, their hands finally meeting in the suffocating chaos. Together, they turned to run, but the ground shifted beneath them. A low growl reverberated through the forest, an unearthly sound that shook the very air. From the depths of the earth, the devourer stirred, an entity so ancient that it defied description. It was a massive shadow in decay, an amorphous being that pulsed with a darkness more profound than night itself. Emily felt its gaze upon her, a weight that pressed down on her spirit, threatening to consume her entirely. "Run!" she screamed, dragging Jason along as they sprinted through the tangled underbrush, branches clawing at their skin as they raced away from the clearing. But the forest was alive, and it twisted around them, the path ever shifting, leading them deeper into its heart. Despair threatened to overtake her. It was a trap, a design of the forest to lead them to the very maw of the devourer, to surrender them to its insatiable hunger. Yet, even as they stumbled forward, a flicker of hope ignited within her. They had not yet succumbed to the whispers. They were still alive, still fighting. But for how long? With the weight of despair clawing at her heart, Emily forged ahead, dragging Jason through the ever-shifting darkness of the forest. The whispers that had haunted her since their arrival had morphed into a maddening cacophony, rising in urgency, echoing the frantic beating of her heart. She could feel the presence of the devourer drawing nearer, a palpable force that loomed behind them, ever hungry, ever insatiable. "We have to find a way to stop this," Jason gasped, his breath coming in ragged gasps as they pushed through the dense underbrush. "It wants us, Emily. We can't let it take us." But what hope remained in her? The very essence of the forest seemed to conspire against them, each step forward ensnaring them deeper in its vile grasp. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled limbs reaching out like skeletal fingers, as if eager to join the undead in their grim purpose. It was as though the entire world had conspired to entrap them, the shadows coalescing into an ever-tightening noose. In a moment of desperation, Emily recalled the stone in the clearing. The ancient symbols that had pulsed with an unnatural energy, calling forth the dead, could they also hold the key to their salvation? With a sudden surge of clarity, she turned to Jason. "The stone! We need to return to the clearing." "Are you mad?" he exclaimed, fear sparking in his eyes. "That's where they want us. It's our only chance," she insisted, her resolve firming as the urgency of their situation clawed at her. "If we can disrupt whatever ritual they're performing, maybe we can stop the devourer from awakening." With no time to waste, they sprinted back through the forest, their path illuminated only by the sickly glow of the moon filtering through the twisted branches above. The whispers crescendoed around them, urging them forward, yet warning them of the doom that awaited. As they reached the clearing, the sight before them froze Emily's blood. The dead had gathered around the stone, their grotesque forms moving in a frenzied dance, a ritualistic offering to the entity that stirred beneath the soil. The air was thick with a suffocating energy, a dark promise that hung heavy in the night. "We have to break the circle," Emily shouted over the chaos, her voice raw with fear. Jason nodded, determination igniting in his eyes. They rushed toward the stone, weaving through the writhing mass of the undead, hearts pounding in unison with the frenzied ritual. But as they approached, a force pushed against them, an invisible barrier that clawed at their very souls. The dead turned their hollow eyes toward them, mouths stretching into impossibly wide grins, the horror of their existence reflecting the very darkness they sought to unleash. "No! You cannot interfere," a voice, deep and rumbling, emanated from the stone itself, reverberating through the air like thunder. It was the devourer, awakening from its slumber, its hunger insatiable. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Emily felt the earth pulse with the heartbeat of the ancient being. With renewed determination, she reached for the stone, the symbols blazing with light as she touched its cold surface. "We can't let this happen," she cried, channeling every ounce of strength she had left. The stone pulsed in response, a cacophony of light erupting from its core, illuminating the clearing in a blinding brilliance. "You cannot defy the cycle," the devourer howled, rage emanating from the earth as the ground split, dark tendrils reaching out to ensnare them. But Emily held firm, focusing all her energy on the stone, her will bending against the ancient power that sought to engulf her. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. The energy between them crackled, a violent clash of light and shadow, as the very fabric of the forest writhed in agony. The dead howled in unison, their voices rising in a chorus of despair and fury. Emily felt the weight of their longing for vengeance, for release, but she refused to give in. "You are not bound by this fate," she screamed, her voice cutting through the darkness. "You can find peace." As her words echoed through the night, the energy of the stone surged, resonating with her plea. One by one, the undead paused, their hollow eyes reflecting the light of the stone. A flicker of understanding crossed their faces, a brief moment of clarity amid the chaos. The connection between them and the devourer wavered, the grip of the ancient being loosening as Emily's conviction pierced through the darkness. But in that moment of hope, the devourer roared with fury, its form coalescing into a monstrous silhouette, a dark figure that towered over them like a living nightmare. It lashed out, tendrils of shadow seeking to consume them both, but Emily stood firm, the light of the stone enveloping her like a shield. "You will not take us," she declared, her voice unwavering against the tempest. With a final surge of energy, the stone erupted in blinding light, engulfing the clearing and its dark inhabitants. The world around her twisted and contorted, a maelstrom of light and shadow as the devourer writhed in rage. For a fleeting moment, Emily felt weightless, suspended in a realm where light and dark intertwined. Then, with a deafening roar, the force of the stone collapsed upon itself, sending a shockwave through the forest. The ground trembled violently as the dead were drawn back into the earth, their anguished cries merging with the howling wind. And just like that, it was over. Emily awoke on the forest floor, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. She blinked against the harsh brightness, disoriented and breathless. The air was still, the oppressive weight that had hung over the forest dissipating like a forgotten dream. As she pushed herself upright, she realized she was alone. Jason was gone. Panic clawed at her heart, but she forced herself to breathe. They had fought against the devourer, and she had seen the flicker of hope in the eyes of the dead. Perhaps, just perhaps, they had found their peace. With trembling hands, she brushed the dirt from her clothes and looked around the clearing, now bathed in the soft light of morning. The stone stood silent, the symbols faded to mere shadows of their former selves. The forest, once a place of terror, now seemed almost serene. Yet, deep in her heart, a lingering sense of unease remained. The whispers had been silenced, but she knew the forest's secrets were not entirely forgotten. Somewhere, beneath the earth, the devourer lay dormant once more, biding its time until the cycle of darkness returned. As she stepped into the morning light, Emily vowed to carry the memory of that night with her, a reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the dead, and the horrors that lie beneath the surface of the world. For in the end, she understood the truth. Some legends never die, they simply wait for the right moment to rise again.